Singapore in early 1942 was a city holding its breath. It was a jewel of the British Empire, a bustling port humming with life. But a shadow was stretching across the sunny island. The war in Europe felt distant, a problem for another hemisphere. Here, under the tropical sun, life had continued with a semblance of normality. People went to work, they shopped in busy markets, they gathered in clubs and cafes, discussing the news from afar. Yet the whispers of conflict were growing louder, carried on the sea breeze. The Japanese Empire was on the march across Asia, and its gaze was fixed firmly on this strategic prize. The city was supposed to be a fortress, an impregnable bastion. That was the official line, the comforting story told in London and repeated in Singapore. Beneath the surface, however, a quiet panic was beginning to simmer. The city was filled with British, Australian, and Indian troops, a visible sign of the empire's might. But there were cracks in the facade. Many of the soldiers were inexperienced, undertrained for the brutal reality of jungle warfare. Why was Singapore so important? To understand the shock of its fall, we must first understand its value. For the British Empire, Singapore was more than just a colony. It was the linchpin of its power in Asia. It was the Gibraltar of the East. This small island guarded the Strait of Malacca, one of the most critical shipping lanes in the world. Whoever controlled Singapore controlled the flow of trade between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. It was the gateway between East and West. Oil from the Middle East, rubber and tin from Malaya, goods from Europe, all passed through this vital choke point. Losing Singapore meant losing control of this immense economic artery. It was a blow the empire could not afford. The naval base at Sembawang was the crown jewel. It was a gargantuan feat of engineering, built over 2 decades at enormous expense. It was designed to be the home of the Royal Navy's Eastern Fleet, but the fortress had a fatal weakness. Its magnificent 15-inch coastal guns were a source of immense pride. These colossal weapons were designed to repel a naval invasion. However, they were almost entirely useless against an army attacking from the land. The planners in London had never seriously countenanced a full-scale land invasion through the supposedly impassable jungle of Malaya. It was a catastrophic failure of imagination. Beyond its military and economic value, Singapore held a powerful symbolic meaning. It represented the prestige and permanence of the British Empire. While the British clung to outdated plans, the Japanese were preparing a masterpiece of modern warfare. Their plan to take Singapore was audacious, meticulously planned, and executed with breathtaking speed and ferocity. The man in charge was General Tomoyuki Yamashita, a formidable and ruthless commander known as the Tiger of Malaya. He understood that surprise and momentum were his greatest weapons. He rejected the conventional wisdom that the Malayan jungle was an impassable barrier. Instead, he saw it as a corridor, a means of concealment that would allow his army to strike where the British least expected it. The Japanese 25th Army was not a massive force. In fact, they were outnumbered by the Allied defenders. But they compensated for their lack of numbers with superior training, tactics, and sheer determination. One of their most ingenious tactics was the use of bicycles. Thousands of soldiers pedaled their way down the narrow jungle tracks and roads of Malaya. This allowed them to cover vast distances rapidly, constantly outflanking and encircling the retreating Allied forces. It was a simple, low-tech solution that proved devastatingly effective. Yamashita's forces also achieved total air and sea superiority from the very beginning. On December 10, 1941, just days into the campaign, Japanese bombers located and sank 2 of Britain's most powerful warships, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse. The ships had been sent to deter the Japanese, but without air cover, they were sitting ducks. Their sinking was a disaster. It shattered British naval power in the region and left the land forces completely exposed. In just 55 days, Yamashita's army had swept down the entire 700-kilometer length of the Malay Peninsula. They now stood at the Johor Strait, looking across the water at their final objective, the fortress of Singapore itself. The audacious gamble had paid off spectacularly. The final act of the tragedy began on the night of February 8, 1942. Under the cover of darkness and a ferocious artillery barrage, Japanese troops began crossing the Johor Strait in collapsible boats. They landed on the northwest coast of the island, an area defended by inexperienced Australian troops. The fighting was brutal and confused. In the darkness, illuminated only by explosions and burning oil depots, the defenders were overwhelmed. General Percival and his command were caught by surprise. They had expected the main assault to come from the northeast and had positioned their strongest units there. Once again, Yamashita had outthought his opponent. The days that followed were a chaotic and desperate struggle. The British, Australian and Indian units fought bravely in isolated pockets, but their command structure was collapsing. Communications broke down, orders were confused or never arrived. The Japanese pushed relentlessly inland, their tactics proving just as effective on the island as they had in the jungle. They exploited gaps in the defensive lines, encircling and destroying pockets of resistance. The Allied forces were pushed back towards the city itself. Water pipes were shattered, leaving the defenders and the million-strong civilian population with a dwindling supply. The city was a scene of pandemonium, choked with smoke, refugees, and retreating soldiers. One of the most critical moments came at the Battle of Bukit Timah. This area of high ground dominated the center of the island. It was where the British stored their main supplies of food, fuel, and ammunition. It was also where the island's reservoirs were located. The fighting for this strategic point was intense. Japanese soldiers, supported by tanks, fought their way up the slopes against determined but uncoordinated resistance. By February 11th, just 3 days after the invasion began, Bukit Timah had fallen. With it, the British lost their main supply depots and control of their water supply. The strategic situation had become hopeless. The battle for Singapore was effectively over. The end came on February 15, 1942. With his army shattered, his supplies gone, and his city facing a humanitarian catastrophe, General Percival knew he had no choice. He met General Yamashita at the Ford Motor Factory at Bukit Timah to discuss terms. The meeting was a study in contrasts. Yamashita was imperious and demanding. Percival was haggard and defeated. The Japanese commander bluffed, exaggerating his strength and threatening to annihilate the city if the British did not surrender immediately. In reality, Yamashita's own army was exhausted and low on ammunition, but his bluff worked. Percival agreed to an unconditional surrender. At 5:15 p.m., the guns fell silent. The so-called impregnable fortress had fallen in just 1 week. History is not just about generals and strategy, it is about people. The fall of Singapore was a deeply human tragedy, experienced by soldiers and civilians on all sides. A young British gunner, part of a coastal artillery crew, later recalled the sheer confusion. He spoke of turning his massive 15-inch gun around to fire inland, a task it was never designed for. He remembered the feeling of helplessness as Japanese planes flew overhead with impunity, and the terror of fighting an enemy he could rarely see in the dense vegetation. His war diary entry shifted from confident bravado in January to despair and fear by February, a testament to the speed of the collapse. He was fighting for an empire that seemed to be dissolving before his very eyes. For the local population, the invasion was a nightmare visited upon their homes. A Chinese teenager living in the city described the terrifying air raids. She spoke of huddling with her family under the kitchen table as bombs whistled down, the house shaking with each explosion. She saw fires raging through her neighborhood and witnessed the streams of wounded and terrified people fleeing the fighting. Her family shared their dwindling supplies of rice and water with neighbors, a small act of solidarity in the midst of chaos. She remembered the eerie silence that fell after the surrender, a silence filled not with relief, but with a new and potent dread of what the conquerors would do next. Even the Japanese soldiers, the victors, had their own stories of hardship. A veteran of the 25th Army wrote about the grueling march through Malaya. He described the oppressive heat, the constant threat of disease, and the leeches that seemed to be everywhere. He fought on a diet of rice and sheer willpower. While he felt pride in his army's stunning success, he also wrote of the brutalizing effect of the fighting. He saw friends die beside him and carried the heavy burden of the acts he was ordered to commit. His account reveals that even for the conquerors, the campaign was a brutal ordeal that left deep and lasting scars on their own humanity. An Australian nurse stationed at Alexandra Military Hospital witnessed one of the worst atrocities of the campaign. These personal stories remind us that behind the statistics of war are individual lives, forever changed by the events they endured. The surrender was not the end of the suffering. For the 80,000 Allied soldiers who laid down their arms, it was the beginning of a new hell. They became prisoners of war, subject to the whims of their captors. The Japanese Imperial Army did not adhere to the Geneva Convention. They viewed surrender as the ultimate dishonor, and they treated their prisoners with contempt and brutality. The POWs were crammed into squalid camps, most notably at Changi on the eastern end of the island. Food was scarce, often just a small bowl of watery rice a day. Disease, dysentery, malaria, cholera, ran rampant, and medical supplies were almost non-existent. The conditions were designed to break the men's bodies and spirits. Thousands of prisoners from Singapore were later transported across Asia to work as slave labor on projects like the infamous Thai-Burma Railway. Here they were forced to work from dawn until dusk in horrific conditions, carving a railway through dense jungle and solid rock with basic hand tools. They were starved, beaten, and worked to death. The stories of the so-called Death Railway are a testament to both the depths of human cruelty and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Men formed bonds of friendship, risking their lives to share food or care for the sick, finding ways to maintain their dignity in the face of unimaginable horror. For the civilian population of Singapore, the Japanese victory ushered in a period of terror known as the Sionan-to era, meaning Light of the South Island. The occupation was particularly brutal for the large Chinese community. The Japanese military command was intensely suspicious of the Chinese, whom they believed were loyal to their enemies in mainland China. They launched a horrific purge called the Suk Ching, or cleansing through purification. Thousands of Chinese men between the ages of 18 and 50 were rounded up. They were screened, and anyone suspected of being anti-Japanese, teachers, intellectuals, former volunteers, was taken to beaches and massacred. This campaign of terror was designed to crush any potential resistance. Life under occupation was a daily struggle for survival. The fall of Singapore was arguably the greatest military disaster in British history. It was more than just the loss of a battle or a colony. It was a devastating blow to the prestige of the British Empire. Winston Churchill himself called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The myth of white superiority, a cornerstone of colonial rule, was shattered. An Asian power had decisively defeated a European power. The sight of 80,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops surrendering to a smaller Japanese force sent a shockwave across the globe. It was a humiliation from which the British Empire would never fully recover. The fall marked the beginning of the end of British dominance in Asia. The human cost was immense. Over 5,000 Allied soldiers were killed or wounded during the brief campaign. But this was just the beginning. Of the 80,000 who became prisoners of war, more than a quarter would die in captivity. The civilian toll was even higher. Thousands were killed during the fighting and air raids. Tens of thousands more were murdered during the Suk Ching massacre. The years of occupation brought further hardship and death. This was not a clean, distant war. It was a conflict that inflicted deep trauma on hundreds of thousands of lives. The defeat forced a painful re-evaluation of military strategy. The reliance on fixed fortifications and battleships had been proven fatally obsolete. The failure to anticipate a land-based attack through the jungle was a catastrophic intelligence failure. Modern warfare required flexibility, superior air cover, and troops well-trained for the specific environment. The lessons learned would influence military thinking for decades to come. Ultimately, the fall of Singapore paved the way for a new future. The brutal Japanese occupation fueled the desire for independence. When the British returned in 1945, they did not return to the same deferential colony. The spell of invincibility had been broken. The people had forged a new sense of identity and resilience. The road to independence had been opened. Today, the vibrant, independent nation of Singapore stands as a testament to rising from the ashes. The fall was an end, but it was also a beginning.